What's happening, everybody? Who the hell is that guy in the thumbnail today? I haven't a clue. Who are these names I typed in the show title? I know them not. What I do know is that I broke my glasses, and so this is, I don't know if anybody remembers this. Folks that have been watching me doing shows for the entirety of, Fantasy NBA Today in the old days, and now Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball, which, by the way, welcome to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. You guys might remember these glasses. These ones were shattered, I believe, by my dog in 2020 or 2021. And my newer pair, something just got chipped off one of the lenses. So those are in the shop. And luckily, I had these super glued back together. Earpiece just comes right off. But it'll get us through today's show. And then I can shoot back down to the shop and deal with the new ones. But anyway, thank you for joining us, everybody. It's rookie time. I know it hurts to say it. I don't know if I can even call it Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball today. It's just Man Squad Fantasy Basketball, which feels chauvinist and or super weird. I don't like the way that sounds. Old Man Squad sounds great. Just Man Squad. It's amazing the difference that the word old makes, at least in my mind. I'm Dan Besbris, at Dan Besbris on Twitter. Please follow at Old Man Squad over on social media. I will follow you back from that account. Whoever the hell you are, go follow Old Man Squad. You'll get a follow back. You can grow your Twitter following by one by finding that one and checking them out. And today here, in just a matter of seconds, we'll be joined by Kyle Irving, an awesome first-timer on any of shows that I've done. He's with the Sporting News. He covers the NBA draft and also is an avid fantasy junkie, which makes him a perfect, I say, fit for trying to convince my grouchy old butt to care about rookies coming into the NBA. I forgot on the last two shows to remind you all, please, if you're watching the show, hit the thumbs up button on YouTube and subscribe. If you're listening after the fact, however you're taking it in, specifically Apple and Spotify, those are kind of the big two. I know there's a bunch of other ones, but follow, subscribe. If you've got a moment to leave a 5-star review, I'd very much appreciate it as we continue to try to build this thing up brick by frickin' brick. It ain't easy, folks, to start a brand new podcast and get that full latch on. So I need you guys to do whatever you can to assist in that department. And without further ado, you guys came to hear me look confused while someone talks to me about people in an upcoming draft class. So let's just frickin' do that and bring in Kyle right now. Okay, so everybody knows the deal with me. I'm going to say at the beginning of all of these segments during this few-day stretch running up to the NBA draft, I know nothing about college basketball players. I don't pay attention to them. I don't check out rookies until like 2 days before the draft. And even then, I mostly just rely on very smart people. This is how I'm going to segue into today's guest to tell me who I should actually be paying attention to. So for the first time on this show, for the first time on any show that I've been hosting, Kyle Irving at Kyle Irv _. Two things, Kyle. Number one, thank you so much for carving out time to come on and educate me about extraordinarily young people that are about to play in the NBA. And two, what is a college athlete? I don't know. I don't understand these things. It's a joke that didn't land. How you doing, man? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing great, Dan. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to, hopefully illuminating you and your audience on this draft class, which not a lot of people are very excited about. I would be lying if I were to say this is my favorite draft class that I've covered in the 6 years that I've been covering the NBA draft as closely as I have been over at the Sporting News. But I will also say that the last time that we said there was a bad draft, that was in 2020. And I just wrote down a list of names of players who are still in the rotation from that quote unquote bad 2020 draft class. And that is Anthony Edwards, LaMelo Ball, Obi Toppin, Denny Avdia, Tyrese Halliburton, Onyeka Okongwu, Aaron Nesmith, whether you want to say Sadiq Bey and Isaiah Stewart, Presta Chua, Tyrese Maxey, Peyton Pritchard, Jaden McDaniels, Desmond Bane, Trey Jones, that's a pretty damn good list of guys that are either, obviously we have some of the stars like Anthony Edwards, LaMelo, Obi Toppin. He was just the next guy on my list. I would not qualify him as a star. But Tyrese Halliburton is what I meant to say. There are plenty of stars on that list. Tyrese Maxey, but a lot of guys that are just really stars in their role. And to me, with this year's draft class, when people say it's a bad draft, that just usually means it's light on star power, light on guys that are going to be franchise altering talents. But I still think that this draft class has a lot of potential in terms of guys that can fill a role, guys that can be the, seventh, eighth man on your bench. They're not super exciting. They're not going to get you, maybe to tune into 2 days worth of the NBA draft, which we're going to get this year on 2 separate days. But all of a sudden, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, the same way we look back at the 2020 draft class, there's a lot of guys that are going to be able to make an impact on NBA rosters. So I'm excited to get into that a little bit with you and answer any questions you might have.
Okay, so going back actually to the 2020 class, I feel like of all the names you listed, the one that I remember sort of beating projections on the fantasy side in particular was Tyrese Halliburton, right? Wasn't he sort of the one that everybody was like, yeah, he might be okay. And then he was like a 5th or 6th rounder. And then everybody else was kind of like, they did stuff like, I feel like LaMelo Ball was decent, but then banged up a bit. Honestly, since COVID, my brain doesn't remember things all that great. But do you feel like looking back, and then we'll look ahead to what's about to happen, that those guys made an immediate impact, or was it more of a ramp up for a lot of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually was going to ask you this because as I was going through prepping for this show, I was trying to get an idea, just going back through the last 3 or so draft classes, to get a tally on players, on rookies that made an impact, fantasy impact in their rookie season. I had roughly counted 8 or 9 guys in each of the last 3 draft classes who were rosterable in fantasy. I'm not saying you would draft them, but they were rosterable. Like last year's class, for example, like Wemby, obviously the top guys like Wemby, Brandon Miller, the Thompson twins ended up being, on and off rosterable all season long. Derek Lively was great. Keontae George, high usage guy, might tank your field goal percentage and turnovers and things like that. But, even like TJD, Pochemski, Gigi Jackson had moments at the end of the year. Like there was a solid 8 guys in that draft class. So do you feel like in terms of rookie contributions in fantasy, it's around that number every year for guys that make an impact?
I feel like this last year was more than usual, or at least that's the way it maybe that's more of a gut thing than an actual statistical numerical thing. But obviously you had the top end Wemby, Chet, who, drafted the previous year, but technically a rookie. Brandon Miller, who was more like way back end until the entire Hornets team either got hurt or shut down. And then, like you said, Thompson twins, Sarr was on at the beginning and then not after the first few weeks. And then Amin Thompson was very good after Alperen Şengün went down. Trace Jackson Davis, there was a few weeks there towards the end of the year. Like a lot of them had those kind of like pockets of nice usefulness. Lively would have been the one that probably stuck all year, but he couldn't stay healthy. That was more of his issue this last season. So, and to me, that actually felt like a better than normal situation to have a bunch of rookies that like had those moments. Whereas in a lot of years, you come in with the star power guys, they typically underperform, which was different this year because Wemby was amazing and Chet was amazing. So you had the 2 biggest names overperform, which almost never happens. Comparing it, in my mind, I'm comparing it to like the Trae Young, Luka Doncic draft, which I know has been a while now, but that's the one that always sticks in my brain is like these 2 guys came in with a boatload of hype and they didn't hit it. Luka was like top 100 that year. Trae was well outside of it until the last 6 weeks of the season when his field goal percent went from, 38 to like 44. And that wasn't obliterating it. Now, again, punting can change the way that type of stuff works. But I thought this last season was one of the most successful rookie years that I can remember. And it's why I'm trying to soften my stance on rookies a little bit. But people that listen to my show and watch it often, mostly my softening is with big men who don't ruin your free throw percent. They just have an easier pathway to fantasy value as rookies because they don't have to have the ball in their hand that much to make a bunch of mistakes with it. And so to that segue now, who are some of the guys? Well, I mean, we can go through it one by one, really, but as you're looking at this draft where it's not supposedly, at least, loaded with star power, or so I'm told, there are still names out there I've heard that could have fantasy value just because of stat set, not star power. So where do you want to start today as you walk me through, hey, Dan, here's some guys that are interesting?
Yeah. So I think like what I try to do is use the past success of rookies in fantasy to try and be like, okay, like which guys in this class could have similar roles. And I guess that's where we start at the top with Alex Sarr, who is he's number one on my big board. You know, as the latest reports, it looks like he may not end up going number one overall to the Hawks. The Hawks seem to really like Zaccharie, Risacher, the French sharpshooter, and Donovan Clingan from UConn. But, you know, Sarr is number one on my board because he is someone that kind of fits that lively type mold of a player who can block at the floor of his potential. He is someone that can block shots, rim run, catch lobs, you know, boost your field goal percentage. He's going to chase down rebounds because he brings a ton of energy on the glass. So, you know, and that's at his floor. When he was playing in the NBL in Australia, he was showing moments of being able to handle the ball. He was showing moments of, you know, proving he has a little bit of an outside touch. Those types of things need to be polished. And I think that depending on the team that he lands in and the situation he lands in, let's say he goes number 2 to Washington, because I feel like that's probably the furthest that, you know, he would fall in this draft, especially because Washington could use a big man like that. I think Alex Sarr would, on that end, maybe become a little bit more dangerous in terms of turnovers and tanking field goal percentage, because he might have a little bit more freedom to do those types of things and get creative offensively. But, you know, if he were to end up in somewhere like Atlanta and Trae Young, let's assume that he doesn't get traded, and he's just turns into a pick and roll machine the same way that we kind of saw with Derek Lively and Luka Doncic, I really feel like Alex Sarr is someone that could impact fantasy value at the highest level there.
What is his free throw situation like? Acceptable?
That's a great question. I want to say he shot around 75%. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but he does have like the potential to, like, he's shown brief shooting touch. Like, he's not someone that, I don't even think he attempted a 3-pointer per game in Australia, but like he had those showcase games against the G League Ignite earlier in the year where he was kind of playing with a little bit more freedom, trying to show the scouts what he has. And that's where you kind of saw him, you know, attempt some threes and things like that. So, you know, he's not someone I wouldn't think would be someone that would tank your free throw percentage.
The when you talk about a player like Sarr, how do you try to translate his numbers? Because there isn't, like, a lot of times you can look at a college player who, you know, played 4 years and 25 to 30 minutes or more, whatever, per game, but there isn't as much data on Sarr, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the data is limited, especially because he is playing in a professional league overseas where he's not the star of his team the way that these college players are. So he's still coming off the bench. He's making an impact playing against other professionals, and the NBL is one of the best leagues in the world. But, you know, you do have to kind of temper your expectations there. I think that if he were to play, I'm going to throw random numbers out there. If he were to play a full starters load for, let's call it the Wizards or the Hawks, I think he could average somewhere around 12 to 14 points. Let's call it 8 rebounds per game, but he's really good defensively. So he could be someone that could get you a block and a steal per game, maybe even over a block per game, because, you know, he does have some switchability. He is someone that could just stand underneath the rim and protect the rim that way. I really like his defensive upside, and I think that's where the fantasy value also comes in.
Do you think he comes in with a ton of hype, or do you think there's a certain mitigation on that because he doesn't come in as a guy who scored a lot at some previous level? Legitimately, I'm not trying to lead the witness here. I really don't know.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on there. Like, I think it's someone that doesn't come in with as much hype because the expectation isn't going to be Sarr's going to come in and become our number one scorer, no matter where he lands, Washington, Atlanta, like wherever it is. You know, he's going to be kind of, I don't want to call him a role player because he has potential to be much better than that, but like he's going to fit a specific role, at least as a rookie, in my opinion. I don't think he's someone that's going to come in, burst on the scene, and even at his absolute best, average 18 to 20 points per game. I just don't see it happening. But, you know, down the line, maybe at some point, but right now in the immediate, depending on where he ends up, I could see him being more of a guy who's like your third option, as more so just a lob threat as a scorer, maybe some brief flashes out of the post in spotting up as a shooter, but really doing a lot of damage as a lob catcher, a rebounder, a shot blocker, and someone that can come up with some steals.
Talking to Kyle Irving at Kyle Irv _ of the Sporting News. Who would be another player? Let's go to number 2. Wait a minute. I don't want to make it sound like this is your list or something like that. Who is another player that we should keep an eye on?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's other big men like Donovan Clingan, for example, kind of reminds me of Walker Kessler in a way. And I think that, like,
Hmm.
that was my comparison that I gave him after his freshman year when he was playing a backup role at UConn. And Walker Kessler, kind of same thing. He was at North Carolina his freshman season, transferred to Auburn, became one of the most dominant defensive players in the NCAA, averaged like 4.5 blocks per game. Clingan was kind of the same situation where his per 48 numbers were insane. But he wasn't playing all that much because Adama Sanogo was the starting center at UConn. And then he got that starting role last year and obviously anchored that team to a championship with his defense inside. So, I don't think we have to talk too much about him because it's kind of the similar talking points that I was just saying about Sarr. He's a better shot blocker than Sarr is at this point just because of sheer size and in his wingspan. But, and he's not really going to be someone that's going to be stepping out and shooting at all. He's really just going to be finishing dunks and putbacks around the rim and things like that. So even better for your field goal percentage. But, he's another player who, in my opinion, like when it comes to fantasy, he might actually be number 2. He's not number 2 on my big board. I think I had him at 7 when I just did it. But in terms of fantasy value, he might be my number 2 rookie behind Alex Sarr.
Interesting. If I'm remembering right, and this again, I say I know nothing. I know like one or two things. I remember Clingan being not that great of a foul shooter.
No, he's not. He's not a good foul shooter. And
Rats.
you know what? They're trying to, it's pre-draft workouts. They're trying to show all these videos of him spotting up from the perimeter. Oh, look at his shooting touch. We see it every year. I'm not a big believer in him being someone that will, step outside, knock down threes, stretch the floor. I hope I'm wrong. It'd be awesome if he could, but I don't see him being someone that is even knocking down free throws at a 70% clip.
Are there any places he could end up where he could see 25 minutes a game out of the shoot, or does it seem like a situation more like a Lively or a Trace Jackson Davis, which would be like Lively but later in the year, effectively? Like who has the need for a player like this, and are there minutes available in such a spot?
I feel like the teams that, you're seeing pop up a lot right now, Atlanta is seriously considering him at number 1, apparently, because they haven't had Alex Sarr in for a workout. And I guess they've worked out Clingan a couple times. But, I think Washington, again, is a team that could really use a defensive presence like that in the middle where he would be a starter from day one and be able to play, that 25-minute workload. Houston, maybe depending on what they, if they feel like Şengün could play off of him, things get a little tricky there because then what are you doing with Thompson? And then you have, not that Şengün's a non-shooter, but then you have 2 non-shooters on the court with Clingan and Thompson. So, that's kind of a clunky fit, but I could see them trying to make that work if they wanted to. So I think ideally for Clingan in terms of fantasy, at the very top of the draft board, it probably, again, kind of like Sarr would be Atlanta or Washington.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm slightly intrigued by this because you've started me off here with 2 big men. This is basically the realm that I've ventured into, because if you look at the fantasy stuff on this, and I don't want to go too far on this rant because I want to make sure people keep hearing from you. The fantasy players, rookies at least, that have typically beaten their ADP have been big guys. And one of the only exceptions over like the last half decade is Jalen Williams in OKC. He's like the lone wing or guard that came out and was just better than where he was drafted for the season. Most of the other ones, it's like guards are awful for 4 months, and then sometimes they get a little bit better after the trade deadline when other teams stop trying and the turnovers come down and all that kind of stuff. So you've hit me with 2 big dudes so far, one who's not that bad of a foul shooter and one who's not that good of a foul shooter, but maybe blocks a little bit more. But it sounds like, Kyle, like ultimately, and I get it, like this is sort of Captain Buzzkill for me over here, but that's what I do. It's an old man squad after all. I shouted clouds. We can't really do much of anything until we know where they fall, right?
It does feel that way, but I'm actually going to go back to what you just said as a segue because we're on the same page. This next section that I had was actually kind of like the do-it-alls headlined by Jalen Williams, a player like that who, exceeded his rookie season. And I don't think anybody would have expected him to be as good as he turned out to be. But there are some players in this draft class who, give me shades of what he could do in terms of being able to fill multiple categories. They're not going to be as efficient as he was. I don't remember his rookie shooting numbers off the top of my head. He was obviously extremely efficient this past season. But, Stephon Castle, someone that you and I talked about right before we just jumped on here, he is a player to me where, he feels like a Jalen Williams in the sense that he can do multiple things. He wants to play point guard at the NBA level. He said he refuses to work out or even consider getting drafted by teams that already have a starting point guard in place. So that kind of, he's trying to guide himself to a certain destination there. And it's especially interesting because he really played more on the wing at UConn, but he's someone that can play with or without the ball in his hands. I don't want to compare him. I'm going to loosely compare him to like Josh Hart as someone who could play off the ball, do the dirty work, get a lot of rebounds, putbacks, things like that, still rack up assists. He's going to get you a couple steals and blocks. But to me, he kind of feels like in that J-Dub range. He's not the shooter that Jalen Williams is, but in that range of someone who can fill multiple stat categories while maybe not tanking your free throw percentage or your field goal percentage, because he takes smart shots and he doesn't really force offense because he's not a super, superb shot creator, even though, Jalen Williams has obviously developed into that. But I think you kind of get what I'm saying with Stephon Castle.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that. Do you think I'm sort of rolling these guys together, but I don't want to cut you off. Is there anyone else that you wanted to get into the discussion today? Because then I have kind of like a broad topic, tie it all together type of question for you. And I also promised that I would get you out of here in around 20 minutes, and I want to at least get close to keeping my promise. Who are some of the other names folks should watch for before I hit you with that? What I think might be kind of a complicated last question, but I do feel like I need to ask it.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, a couple of the guys that I have on my radar, Ron Holland from the G League Ignite is someone who I kind of had in that same do-it-all type category. He's someone that I feel like is sliding down draft boards a little bit, but I think people are going to realize how talented he really is. I think he's one of the most versatile defenders in this class. His motor is crazy on the glass. He's someone that averaged 20 points per game with the Ignite this season, even though he really can't create his own shot and his jump shot is not very consistent, which, in turn means his field goal percentage was not very great. But it just goes to show that he is someone that, if he does kind of figure that shot creation part out, if he's already averaging 20 points per game at the professional level without it, he has potential to be a really solid scorer. Reed Sheppard is another kind of fan favorite, draft Nick favorite of, someone that just plays the game. He plays within himself. He's not going to force it. He shot super efficiently at the college level, shot over 50% from the field, over 40% from 3-point range, sharp shooter. He's not going to turn the ball over a lot. Again, a guy that's going to come up with some steals. He's a solid creator. As a passer to, make players around him better. And then you kind of have like the specialists of this draft class, which is like Dalton Knecht out of Tennessee, who is one of my favorite personal prospects. Draft guys always say they have their guy. For me, Dalton Knecht is that. I just think that in terms of a 3-level score, like, exactly what you're going to get. So from a fantasy perspective, he might not stuff a lot of different categories, but he'll get you points per game. He's going to knock down threes. He shot efficiently at Tennessee. We'll see if that translates to the NBA. I think it could, because I think he'll be in more of a defined role, not exactly stand in the corner and catch and shoot, although he could do that. I think he has more to his game than that, but I do think that, that he's not going to be someone that comes in and is shooting like 30% from the field. I just would be shocked if that's how it goes. And then, Zaccharie Risacher is someone that he is in conversation for the number 1 pick. He had a very up and down season in France. He shot the lights out at the beginning of the year. He kind of hit a little bit of a cold spell in the middle. And then when his draft stock kind of started to plummet and the playoffs came around for his French league, he started to shoot the lights out again. His draft stock went back up. So, in terms of fantasy, that's a player that I'm almost like, you might want to steer clear of unless it's like real late rounds and you're like, oh, I'll take a flyer on this guy, because that is someone that I feel like could, depending on where he ends up, if he's on a bad team and he gets a lot of shots, then that could really tank your field goal percentage. But, at the end of the day, he is considered to be one of the best shooters in this draft class. So he is at least worth mentioning in that kind of specialist category.
I was flipping through some of these names as you were saying them. Reed Sheppard shot 52% from 3 this year. What the hell?
So I feel like those numbers are a little bit inflated, just because like he shot the lights out at the beginning of the year and he kind of maintained it throughout the year. But then like once teams caught on to this kid, and he was coming off the bench for Kentucky for pretty much the entire season. Like once teams kind of caught on to this kid and started tailoring scouting reports around him, I feel like, he started to fall off a little bit. And then he had honestly picked a bad time to have his worst game. He probably played his worst game of the season in the first round of the NCAA tournament when they were upset. But he is a lights out shooter. And again, talk about a player that just plays within himself. Like he's not going to force shots. He could be a catch and shoot guy off the ball. He can also handle the ball and get you some assists. So I do like him, especially if he ends up in a situation like San Antonio, which is a place that he has been rumored to be linked to. I think he would be awesome next to Victor Wembanyama.
Yeah, a little spacing never hurt nobody. So my broad topic question here, again, talking to Kyle Irving at Kyle Irv _ of the Sporting News on NBA prospects here coming into the draft. Do you think of the names you just mentioned in particular, maybe there are others as well, but of the ones that you just brought up, where do you think, again, it was almost impossible to know. It's freaking June 19th. We don't know what team they're going to play on. But, like, do you think any of these guys get drafted inside the top 50, 75? I mean, we're coming off this crazy year where a rookie got drafted in the second round, like across the board in Wembanyama. And Chet was 4th round. I mean, that's pretty insane to have one, let alone two going inside the top 50. A lot of the times you see it more like, Cade Cunningham went at like 90 his rookie season, more like that. So how do you think this one translates to the fantasy side? Is one or the other, something else in between?
Yeah, I really don't see any of these guys getting drafted in the top 50. Honestly, maybe not even in the top 75, unless it gets to the point of the draft where there's a lot of blonde names on the board and someone's like, you know what, I'll take a swing on Alex Sarr. You know what, I'll take a swing on Donovan Clingan or someone like that that's a little bit more safe. But just with the amount of talent that's in the NBA right now and so many different guys that can contribute, especially like the way that roles change hands in the offseason, guys get new opportunities. That might, like we saw Jordan Poole last year, as someone that got drafted astronomically high and then completely fell flat on his face. But that was all because of a new situation and a new role and everything like that. It gets people excited. So like when you consider those types of players who are going to find new situations that might kind of increase their fantasy draft value, I think that's where you start to see the rookies kind of fall off even more. So, these are guys that, I'm getting excited about them because the draft is a week away and I have to get excited about them. It's my job to do that. But, I don't want to steer anybody wrong here and make you think that, you're drafting the next Victor Wembanyama or Chet Holmgren because, those guys just don't exist in this draft class. But I do think that guys like Sarr, Klingan, other guys that I mentioned, whether it's Stephon Castle, Reed Sheppard, depending on where they end up, will be draftable in fantasy, just not inside the top 50, top 75, like you said.
Kyle, what do you got going on these days? Where can people find you? What's the good news? What's the word?
You can find me over at the Sporting News. I'm going to have a lot of draft content coming out. I've been working like crazy this week, especially because the NBA Finals kind of backed me up a little bit. But a lot of draft content coming out within the next week. I'll be doing live coverage over on the sportingnews.com, live analysis and grades and things like that on draft night. So you can check me out over there. And then, like Dan keeps saying, at Kyle Irv _ on Twitter. And if you find yourself on your Twitter page, me and my coworker, Gilbert McGregor, we also have our own podcast, NBA Sound System Canada, where we usually just hit, the treetops topics around the league. But, Gil's, he was a Division I college basketball player at Wake Forest. He has a very, unique insight to the game in that sense. And then, I kind of just provide the BS on the side, when just to give you some laughs and stuff like that. No, it's good stuff. And, check us out over there as well if you find yourself over on my Twitter page.
Kyle, thank you so much for shining lights over here on Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I officially now have some tabs open on my browser that I didn't have before, and I know a few things about all of this stuff. You are the man. Seriously, thank you.
Dan, thank you for having me, man. It was a pleasure. And anytime you want to break down some teenage basketball players that are coming up into the NBA, then I'm the guy for you to give you an idea of who they might be. So thank you for having me, honestly.
Usually aim like 25 years later, but I guess I can make an exception.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me, man.
He is again Kyle Irving at Kyle Irv _ of the Sporting News. Thanks again, my man. And that was Kyle Irving, ladies and gentlemen. First timer on any Dan Besbris podcast. Really happy to have him. Thank you again to Kyle at Kyle Irv _ Kyle IRV _ on social media. He's with the Sporting News. For one, when he mentioned talking about teenagers, I almost just like got up out of my chair and left the room. That one almost broke me. So I was not lying either when I said kind of late in that show, now I have these browser tabs open. And I do. I have a browser tab open for Risacher, a browser tab open for Sarr, one for Clingan, one for Castle, one for Holland, and one for Reed Sheppard, now following that discussion. And so for me, at least, and my takeaway from the chat with Kyle was that, I want to say that I like, what's the very opposite of a deep dive? Like skimming the water off the top of the pond. I pond water skimmed a few of these names that were brought up. And then someone like a Reed Sheppard, super interesting because of that 3-point field goal percentage. If he ended up in a place where he could actually get, 8 shots a game with Kentucky this year, if he could get a few more than that. I am genuinely concerned about any non-big man that doesn't shoot 80% at the free throw line. So Holland was 68% this last year. Castle was at 75.5%. And these are numbers that can come up because Stephon also shot 47 from the field. But again, if you're going to have some of those little holes, you need to make up for them someplace else in a hyper elite way. And so that sort of then draws my attention. And again, I don't know that much about Risacher, and a pond water skim on him really doesn't do any of it justice because the numbers are all over the map, just like Kyle pointed out, where he had like a 57% performance in a Euro Cup and then a 44% shooting performance in the next time around. And like the 2-point field goal percentage is all over the board and the free throw is all over the board. And there aren't that many defensive stats. So then my eyes kind of move to Sarr and Clingan. Sarr, who only played 17 minutes a game with Perth this last year, I averaged 1.3 blocks and a half a steal in 17 minutes a game. He goes someplace in the NBA and gets 25, 26 minutes a game. You could be looking at a guy that gets you over 2 combined defensive stats. But 71% at the free throw line, not backbreaking, only 52% from the field is a little bit of a, okay, is one good enough to balance out the other right out of the chute? Maybe. And then I sort of circle all the way around to Donovan Clingan, who shot 65% his freshman year, 64% this last year, 13 points, 7.5 boards, 2.5 blocks, and a half a steal. He did play 22.5 minutes a game, so there were a little bit more in the minutes per game department in a 40-minute ball game. But if he ends up in a place, if Clingan ends up in a place where his minutes seem like they're decent, it does feel like there could be enough block, rebound, field goal percent combo potential there to counterweight the bad free throw percent. And so my initial pull on all the players that we just talked about with Kyle is that Clingan probably has the safest path to fantasy value quickly because there aren't going to be turnovers. It's going to be all dunks and blocks and rebounds. And then you just hope he doesn't go to the free throw line all that much. He took some free throws in college, but, we'll see how that rate carries over to the NBA. So that's the big question here coming out of it. He's freaking 7'2", so he's going to block some dudes. He might get pushed around a bit by the biggest bigs, but, we saw Chet Holmgren hang. So, very different fantasy players. One of them shoots threes and can hit his free throws. The other one, neither of those, but field goal percent menace. And now we just wait. We find out where these guys end up, and then we find out if there's enough wiggle room for it. I was also thinking, and, again, we won't really know how any of this stuff shakes out. The NBA draft order right now, Atlanta jumping up to the top spot. That was sort of the big surprise twist. But then it's Washington, Houston, who got their pick. I think that was by way of Brooklyn. San Antonio still at 4. Detroit fell to 5. Charlotte, Portland. How many of these guys fall to a place like, Washington up near the top, but then you sort of have to bounce a few spots to get to the next team where you're like, oh, yeah, someone could come in and just have a feature role. San Antonio's got their feature guy. Detroit, you could argue someone could come in the front court and have a feature role, but they've got Duren at center. Is Ausar Thompson the power forward of the future? We'll find out when they set up their new front office and coaching staff and all that good stuff. But you got Cade, obviously, in the backcourt. It seems like Jaden Ivey's kind of the other guy there. Charlotte, Portland, maybe. It's hard to spot a team where you're like, oh, yeah, that team's a team that needs a guy who's going to go take 16 shots. Which of these teams is that? So that's why it's really hard to point at anybody that's not an efficiency big man and say, oh, yeah, that's right where they're going to be. Even a guy like Alex Sarr, Even if he ends up in a place like Washington and gets a pretty big role, yeah. I mean, will the field goal percent be above 50? Will the free throw percent hang above 70? That's one where you could make a case for it. But man, it's hard to see many places besides like Washington big man where you're like, oh yeah, obvious fit. So I'm going to bug some of these dudes over the next few days about that. How does this fit stuff really come together? Is it there? Are we forcing it? I'm going to try to ask the right questions. You don't have to know a lot about something to ask the right questions about that something. And that's my promise to you here as we do these next few shows that will indeed focus on NBA draft stuff. I will ask the questions that make sense. Thank you again to Kyle Irving. I'm Dan Besbris of the Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast at Old Man Squad on Twitter, at Dan Besbris on Twitter. Those are the two handles I want to make sure you guys are following. And again, I said it at the beginning, I'll say it at the end. If you are watching, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. If you are listening to the show, please follow, subscribe, drop a 5-star review if you could. And we'll be back tomorrow with our buddy Noah Rubin talking more about this upcoming draft class. Maybe we'll even get into Dynasty a little bit. Who knows? Maybe we'll go to Bed Bath & Beyond. I don't know if there will be time. What there is time for is me hitting the end broadcast button. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.